The wind rolled over the jagged hills, carrying with it the smell of smoke from villages already consumed by the war. Beyond those hills, a stone giant rose from the earth, a fortress whose walls had stood for over 2 centuries, its towers blackened by the memory of old battles. To the 600 men inside, it was no longer just a stronghold of stone and mortar. It was the last gate, the final barrier between the enemy and the heartland. It was the year, historical year based on chosen conflict, can be adapted later, and the realm had been at war for nearly a decade. Borders had shifted like tides. Armies had clashed in open fields, cities had been sacked, and trade routes strangled. But the enemy's latest advance had been relentless, pushing deep into the realm's frontiers. One by one, the outer defenses had fallen, villages burned, castles abandoned or captured. Now, only this fortress stood in their path. Why this fortress mattered geographically: it was positioned like a dagger's point, wedged between 2 mountain ridges, guarding the only navigable pass into the fertile plains beyond. Whoever held it could control movement in and out of the heartland. For the defenders, it was a lifeline. For the enemy, it was the key to victory. The fortress itself was a marvel of medieval engineering: double curtain walls, a deep moat fed by a mountain spring, and a central keep that loomed over the surrounding landscape. Its towers were topped with iron-capped spires that gleamed in sunlight but looked like blackened claws against the stormy sky. Each stone had been laid not just for defense but for intimidation, its presence alone a warning: do not come closer. The defenders inside the fortress were 600 souls, not all professional soldiers. Many were farmers, blacksmiths, and traders who had taken up arms out of necessity. A small core of battle-hardened veterans anchored their defense, men who had fought in the earlier years of the war, carrying scars both visible and hidden. At their head was Commander Alaric, a man in his late 40s, lean, sharp-eyed, and known for his ability to keep discipline even when facing overwhelming odds. He was not loved for his warmth, but for his steadiness. In a siege, that was worth more than gold. There were others who stood out, even before the first arrow flew: Tomas the bowyer, who had lost his family in the first months of the war and now crafted arrows with deadly precision, swearing each shaft would find its mark. Edrin, a boy no older than 17, who had lied about his age to join the defense, clutching a spear as though it could anchor him in the chaos to come. Serenia, one of the fortress healers, whose skill with herbs had saved more soldiers than any sword. The enemy across the pass, the enemy gathered, a force that dwarfed the garrison in size and resources. Scouts reported thousands, infantry, cavalry, and siege engineers accompanied by war machines that groaned under their own weight. Their banners, deep crimson with the mark of a black sun, were already visible on the horizon. This was not a raiding party. It was a war host with the singular purpose of breaking the fortress, no matter the cost. The enemy commander was rumored to be ruthless, a tactician who valued speed and fear over prolonged negotiations. In villages they had captured, they left no defenders alive, ensuring that every survivor who fled would spread stories of their brutality. The fortress defenders knew this well: there would be no mercy if the walls fell. The calm before the storm on the eve of the siege, the fortress was a hive of quiet, tense activity. The sound of hammers echoed in the courtyards as blacksmiths reforged broken weapons. Buckets of water and sand were placed along the battlements in preparation for fire attacks. Archers practiced in the cold morning air, their breaths fogging with each exhale. The fortress's gates, reinforced with layers of oak and iron, were checked and checked again. Inside the chapel, men knelt in prayer, not for victory, but for courage. The air was thick with the smell of burning tallow candles, the flickering light casting long shadows across the worn stone floor. Some prayed for their families beyond the walls, others prayed for a quick death should the fortress fall. Commander Alaric moved through the ranks without ceremony, speaking to small groups rather than addressing them all at once. His orders were simple: hold the walls. No matter what. The drums of war at midday, the first sound of the siege came, not arrows or battering rams, but drums. Deep, resonant, and slow, like a heartbeat echoing through the mountains. The enemy was making their approach, their formation stretching like a black tide across the pass. From the walls, the defenders could see the glint of armor, the silhouettes of siege towers being wheeled forward, and the dark shapes of catapults against the gray sky. The sight stole the warmth from the air. Even the veterans swallowed hard. The younger recruits gripped their weapons tighter, their knuckles pale. The first arrow as the enemy drew closer, the commander gave a single nod to the archers along the north wall. The order was silent but understood. Bows creaked, strings tightened, and with a sharp whistle, the first arrow arced through the air, vanishing into the ranks below. It was both a declaration and a promise: we will not yield easily. The enemy did not break stride. Instead, they responded in kind. A volley of arrows darkened the sky, raining down on the battlements. The siege had begun. The camera would linger here, on the defenders ducking behind mullions, on the commander's steady gaze, on the enemy lines closing in, before cutting to the next section, where the first true clash would explode against the fortress walls. The enemy's first assault came not with a deafening crash but with an eerie, deliberate patience. As the sun dipped behind the mountains, the crimson banners shifted closer and the faint creak of timber reached the defenders' ears. Siege towers, massive wooden behemoths, rolled forward on thick, iron-bound wheels. Catapults and trebuchets were being assembled in plain sight, their frames rising like skeletal giants against the fading light. Commander Alaric knew what this meant: the enemy was not rushing. They intended to grind the fortress down piece by piece. Still, he also knew that the first attack often set the tone for the siege. If the defenders could repel it decisively, it might buy them precious time and morale. With the last rays of daylight flickering over the battlements, the enemy loosed their opening barrage. Dozens of flaming projectiles soared in slow arcs, their tails of smoke curling in the wind. They struck the outer walls and courtyards, splintering on impact, scattering burning debris. Buckets of water were hurled from the parapets, defenders stamped out fires with booted feet. The fortress's stone walls held firm, but the message was clear: no place within these walls was entirely safe. Alaric barked orders to the archers. Aim for the engineers. Every man and woman along the walls shifted their aim toward the siege crews. Arrows hissed through the air, finding gaps in armor, sending several enemy workers collapsing beside their half-built machines. For a brief moment, a cheer rose from the defenders. But it was short-lived. The enemy had calculated for this and brought more crews forward to replace the fallen without hesitation. Next came the infantry. Shielded by large pavises, towering wooden shields, they advanced in tight formation, archers in the rear sending volleys toward the walls. The sound was like 1,000 angry hornets. Defenders crouched low, rising only to loose arrows or drop rocks. Edrin, the young spearman, flinched with each thud of an arrow striking the parapet near his head. Yet when one enemy soldier attempted to scale a ladder, Edrin's spear thrust forward, knocking the man into the mud below. His hands shook afterward, but his grip tightened. Below, Tomas the bowyer's skill shone. His arrows found their targets with deadly precision, striking joints in armor, cutting through bowstrings, halting enemy climbers mid-ascent. Each shot bought precious seconds. The first real test came when the enemy's vanguard reached the base of the north wall. Grappling hooks were thrown, their iron claws catching on the mullions. Ladders slammed against the stone, and with them came the roar of enemy soldiers eager to spill blood. The defenders responded with everything they had, pouring boiling water, hacking at ropes, pushing ladders backward to send them crashing into the attackers below. The air filled with the sounds of struggle, the clang of steel on steel, the grunts of exertion, the screams of the wounded. One ladder made it high enough for a pair of enemy soldiers to crest the wall. A brutal melee erupted. Alaric himself cut one down with a swift sword stroke, while another was shoved over the edge by a defender's shield. Blood stained the stone, a grim reminder of how close the enemy had come. After nearly an hour of relentless pressure, the enemy withdrew, dragging their wounded with them. The defenders stood panting on the walls, their armor dented, their faces streaked with soot and sweat. The fortress had held, for now. But victory carried a sobering weight. Several defenders lay still, their lifeless forms quickly covered with cloaks. The surviving men and women looked to the fields beyond, the siege towers still loomed, the catapults still intact. This had been only a test. The true storm was yet to come. As the defenders tended to the wounded, a rider slipped into the fortress under cover of darkness, his horse lathered with foam. He bore a sealed letter from the capital. Alaric broke it open by torchlight. The words were brief and brutal: reinforcements delayed. Hold position. Relief uncertain. Alaric crushed the parchment in his fist, his jaw tightening. He said nothing to the troops about the message. To them, the illusion of hope was as important as food or arrows. Out loud, he simply said, "Tonight we prepare for tomorrow." As the moon rose over the fortress, the defenders rebuilt barricades, replenished arrows, and prayed in silence. In the distance, the drums began again, slower now, deeper. The enemy was preparing something far worse for the days ahead. The first snows fell earlier than anyone expected. By mid-autumn, the mountain winds howled through the pass, coating the battlefield in frost and ice. What had begun as a test of arms was now becoming a test of endurance, and the fortress's greatest enemy was no longer just the army outside, but the winter pressing in from all sides. The enemy did not withdraw for the season. Instead, they built winter camps at the base of the hills, their tents forming a ring of steel and firelight around the fortress. Smoke curled from their campfires, visible even through the heavy snow. From the walls, defenders could hear the muffled sounds of hammers as the enemy repaired siege machines under canvas shelters. This was a clear signal: they intended to stay until the fortress fell, regardless of weather. Inside, food stocks began to dwindle faster than expected. Rats gnawed at the grain sacks, and the cold made preservation more difficult. Meat was salted in small quantities, but there was never enough to feed everyone adequately. The daily ration shrank to a fist-sized loaf of bread and a thin broth. Hunger hollowed the cheeks of soldiers and civilians alike. The cold brought sickness. Frostbite claimed fingers and toes. Fevers burned through the barracks, leaving men too weak to stand. Serenia the healer worked without rest, mixing herbs for teas, binding wounds, and tending to the dying. Yet even her skill could not halt the spread entirely. The chapel became a second infirmary, its pews lined with pale faces. Still, there were moments of grim defiance. Soldiers shared their rations with the sick or traded shifts on the walls so others could warm themselves by the meager fires. The bonds between the defenders deepened, forged by shared suffering. The enemy, sensing the defenders' weakening state, increased their night raids. Small bands of their elite warriors would slip through the snow under cover of darkness, scaling sections of wall where the watch was thinnest. These attacks rarely sought to capture the fortress outright, they were meant to bleed it slowly, to kill sentries, to destroy supplies, to wear away morale. One such night raid nearly turned into disaster. During a blizzard, the enemy set fire to one of the northern towers using oil-soaked cloths launched from close range. Flames threatened to spread to the main wall, but Tomas the bowyer rallied a small team to douse it, throwing water, snow, and even wet cloaks until the blaze was smothered. His hands were blistered raw by the time the last embers died, but the wall still stood. By late winter, the defenders were shadows of themselves, gaunt, exhausted, but unbroken. And then, one morning, the sound of birdsong broke the silence. Snow began to melt, dripping from the battlements. The sun returned, weak but persistent, hinting that the worst of the cold was over. But with the thaw came a new dread: the enemy would strike again soon, harder than before. The winter had been a siege of endurance, spring would bring a siege of fire. Spring came not with blossoms, but with the thunder of war drums. The snowmelt had turned the ground into thick, sucking mud, but it also freed the enemy's war engines from their winter shrouds. From the walls, the defenders watched as the siege towers, catapults, and battering rams rolled forward, accompanied by ranks of infantry in fresh armor. The enemy had endured the winter as well, and now they intended to finish what they had begun. The opening salvo was a storm of flaming pitch. Trebuchets hurled heavy clay pots that shattered against the walls, spilling liquid fire that clung to stone and wood alike. Buckets of water only spread it. The defenders had to smother the flames with wet hides and sand. The heat was suffocating, the air thick with smoke. Men coughed black soot between shouts, their eyes streaming as they fought to keep the fire from spreading to the main gates. While the defenders battled the flames, the siege towers crept closer, massive structures bristling with archers. Arrows rained down from their upper platforms, pinning the defenders behind the merlons. At the base of the walls, armored soldiers advanced with shields locked, pushing rams toward the main gate. The sound of wood splintering under each strike echoed through the fortress like a death knell. Edrin, now hardened by months of fighting, stood alongside the veterans, hurling stones from the battlements. His arms ached, but he didn't stop, not even when an enemy arrow grazed his shoulder. Below, Tomas the bowyer picked his targets with clinical precision, dropping enemy officers before they could rally their men. Every moment they bought slowed the enemy's advance. It was the eastern wall that gave way first. A section, weakened by winter frost, cracked under the relentless pounding of a ram. The breach was small at first, a jagged hole barely wide enough for one man, but it widened quickly under hammering blows. Enemy infantry surged forward, forcing the defenders into brutal close-quarters combat. The clash was chaos, steel on steel, the shouts of men, the screams of the wounded. Mud turned to red sludge underfoot. Commander Alaric fought in the thick of it, his sword rising and falling in measured, lethal arcs. "Hold the breach," he roared, his voice carrying above the din. The defenders formed a shield wall within the gap, pushing back against the tide of enemy soldiers. When the breach couldn't be fully sealed, Alaric made the grim decision to abandon the outer district beyond it, pulling his men back to the inner wall. The enemy swarmed into the abandoned quarter, finding only empty homes and booby-trapped streets. Barrels of stones rolled from rooftops crushed entire squads. Narrow alleys became killing zones for crossbowmen hidden in upper windows. The fighting was savage and personal, no drawn battle lines, only desperate skirmishes fought in the shadow of burning buildings. Serenia worked tirelessly in the keep, tending to the wounded carried in from the breach. She moved from cot to cot, her hands slick with blood, her eyes unwavering. "You'll live," she told each soldier, whether it was true or not. As the day dragged into night, Alaric faced his most critical decision yet: commit the last reserves to retake the outer wall, or conserve strength for the enemy's next assault. He chose the latter. With every man and weapon needed for the keep's defense, he ordered the gates to the inner ward barred. The enemy, exhausted from the day's fighting, pulled back to regroup. The defenders stood battered but unbroken, their numbers diminished, their walls scorched. Fires smoldered in the outer district, casting a grim red glow over the fortress. The storm had broken, but it had not yet passed. The next attack could be the last. The fortress had stood for nearly a year. The seasons had turned, yet the siege never truly lifted. The enemy no longer attacked in full force every day, but their grip tightened in other ways, cutting off any attempt to forage, intercepting messenger birds, and sending small units to harass the walls at night. Inside, the defenders had become lean, almost skeletal. Faces once full of resolve were now hollow, their eyes darkened by exhaustion. Armor hung loosely on shrunken frames. Yet their discipline held, every man and woman knew that surrender meant slaughter. By midsummer, the garrison's supplies were critically low. The last barrels of grain were rationed so severely that a single meal could fit into the palm of a hand. Dried beans and stale bread became luxuries. Some men chewed on strips of leather to keep the gnawing in their stomachs at bay. The stables were empty, not because the horses had been released, but because they had been eaten weeks earlier. The enemy, too, was feeling the strain. Their camps bore signs of fatigue, fewer patrols, slower construction of siege works, the same soldiers manning the lines day after day. But unlike the defenders, they could rotate troops out and resupply from farther afield. Time still favored them. Even in this grinding stalemate, moments of bravery kept the fortress alive. Small teams would slip out under moonless skies to raid enemy supply lines, returning with stolen sacks of grain or captured weapons. One such mission, led by Tomas the bowyer, brought back a wagon of dried meat, enough to feed the garrison for 2 precious weeks. Serena's role grew ever more critical. She had begun teaching others her craft, so that even if she fell, the wounded would not be left untended. Her calm presence was a balm to those on the edge of despair. Sensing that the defenders were clinging on by sheer willpower, the enemy commander prepared one final gamble, a massive siege engine larger than any yet deployed. Scouts reported its construction, a reinforced ram with an iron head shaped like a snarling beast, capable of breaking the keep's main gate if it reached it. Alaric knew they couldn't withstand such an assault. "We must strike first," he told his captains. Plans were laid for a daring sally, a sudden attack to destroy the engine before it could be brought to the walls. Under the cover of a raging thunderstorm, a hand-picked force of 50 men slipped out of a concealed postern gate. Rain and darkness masked their approach. They fell upon the siege engine's guards with silent blades, setting the massive structure ablaze. Flames roared upward, lighting the night like a false dawn. The enemy scrambled to respond, but by then the engine was collapsing into charred ruin. The defenders returned bloodied but triumphant. For the first time in months, the fortress walls rang with something close to joy. Yet even in that moment, Alaric knew, this victory would only force the enemy into an even more desperate final assault. The final assault never came. In the days after the siege engine's destruction, the enemy lines remained tense and watchful. Scouts reported unusual movement, entire units pulling back under cover of darkness. At first, Alaric suspected a feint. But by the third dawn, the truth was undeniable: the enemy was gone. Whether their withdrawal was due to losses, dwindling supplies, or political pressures elsewhere in the war, the result was the same: the fortress had endured. The price, however, was written in every corner of the fortress. The outer district lay in ruins, its buildings blackened husks. The once bustling courtyard was now a field of graves, marked with simple wooden crosses. Of the original 600 defenders, fewer than half stood to see the gates reopened. Many who did were forever marked, missing limbs, blinded eyes, or wounds that would never fully heal. When the first relief column finally arrived weeks later, they found not a triumphant army but a band of survivors, lean, hollow-eyed, but unbroken. Word of the defense spread quickly, becoming both a rallying cry and a cautionary tale across the realm. Strategically, the fortress's survival altered the war's course. The enemy's failure to capture it stalled their advance into the heartland, buying the realm critical months to muster new forces. Politically, it proved that the enemy was not unstoppable, that courage, preparation, and sheer stubborn will could hold back even overwhelming numbers. In the years that followed, the siege entered the realm's folklore. Ballads were sung of Tomas the bowyer's deadly arrows, of Serena the healer who never left her post, of young Edrin who grew into a warrior before the fortress walls. Commander Alaric's name became synonymous with endurance, his simple order, "Hold the walls," etched into the stone of the rebuilt gatehouse. Yet those who had been there remembered it differently. For them, it was not glory but survival. Not epic heroics, but small acts, sharing a crust of bread, standing watch for a comrade too sick to rise, choosing to fight one more day when the easier choice was surrender. As the years passed, the fortress returned to quiet. Grass grew where siege towers once burned. The walls were repaired, the graves tended. But when the wind swept through the pass, some swore they could still hear the distant echo of war drums, and the whisper of a promise made by 600 souls: "We will not yield."